At 2:47 in the morning, the sirens started. Not in one city, not in one neighborhood, simultaneously across the entire length of Israel, from the northern border down through the coastal cities and into the Negev. Every alert system the country possesses activated at once. And what followed in the next 11 minutes was the largest single ballistic missile and cluster munitions barrage ever directed at a functioning democracy in the history of modern warfare. Tel Aviv was the primary target, but Tel Aviv was not the only target. And by the time the last impact was recorded and the first damage assessments began coming in through channels that the Israeli government immediately classified, it was clear that something had changed. Not just militarily, not just strategically. Something fundamental had changed about the nature of this conflict, about the rules that everyone had been operating under, and about the question that every government on earth with a stake in Middle East stability was now being forced to answer out loud. How does this end? Stay with me. Because the answer to that question, the real answer, not the official statements and not the diplomatic language, is more complicated and more consequential than anything you're going to hear from any government in the next 48 hours. And understanding it requires understanding not just what Iran fired at Tel Aviv last night, but why this specific attack at this specific moment with this specific weapons combination represents a strategic decision that was years in the making and that changes every calculation going forward in ways that nobody involved was fully prepared for. Start with the weapons because the choice of weapons in this attack is the most important signal Iran sent. And it is a signal that most of the coverage is missing completely. Ballistic missiles are not new. Iran has fired ballistic missiles at Israeli territory before. The April 2024 barrage was the first direct Iranian attack on Israel from Iranian soil. And it generated global shock precisely because of the directness in the scale. But that attack, for all its headline impact, was primarily a demonstration, a proof of capability designed to show that Iran could reach Israeli territory from Iranian soil and that Israeli and American missile defense systems, while effective, were not impenetrable. The world understood that message. The calculation it was designed to shift was shifted. And then over the following months, the conflict continued to escalate in ways that made last night's attack not a repetition of April 2024, but a fundamentally different operation with a fundamentally different purpose. The cluster munitions component is what changes everything. Cluster munitions are not precision weapons. That is not their design purpose, and it is not what they are optimized for. Precision weapons are designed to hit a specific target with minimum collateral effect. Cluster munitions are designed to saturate an area to create multiple simultaneous impact points across a broad zone in a way that overwhelms point defense systems, creates maximum disruption across a wide geographic footprint, and forces the defender to respond to many simultaneous effects rather than a single concentrated strike. The decision to incorporate cluster munitions into a barrage targeting an urban area the size and density of Tel Aviv is not a tactical decision. It is a strategic statement. It is Iran saying in the clearest possible military language that the rules of engagement that have governed this conflict until now are no longer the rules that TAN considers itself bound by. And that statement delivered in the form of a weapon system rather than a diplomatic communiqué is something that every government in the world is now reading with extreme care. Here is what you need to understand about why this moment, this specific night, was chosen. Because the timing is not random. It is never random with Iran. The Iranian strategic doctrine that has governed its use of military force for 40 years is built on the principle of calibrated response. You do not act randomly. You act at the moment when your action will produce the maximum strategic effect relative to the cost you are accepting by acting. The cost of last night's attack is enormous. Iran has now crossed a threshold that changes its international position in ways that will take years to fully unfold. The decision to cross that threshold means that the strategic benefit thrown calculated from the attack was considered worth that cost. And understanding what benefit Iran calculated requires understanding what has happened in the 6 weeks preceding last night. In those 6 weeks, American and Israeli strikes degraded a significant portion of Iran's conventional military capability. The naval losses were severe. The IRGC command structure absorbed personnel losses at a level it has not experienced since the Iran-Iraq War. Energy infrastructure was damaged in ways that are already affecting the Iranian domestic economy. And the Pakistani back channel produced a Hormuz deal that, from the perspective of the IRGC factions that have never been fully aligned with diplomatic compromise, looked uncomfortably like an acknowledgement of weakness. Inside Iran, the political pressure on the supreme leadership from those factions was building. The argument being made inside the Iranian system by the hardliners was simple and powerful. Every day that passes without a response that demonstrates Iranian capability and Iranian will, the adversary's belief that Iran can be degraded into submission grows stronger. Every diplomatic signal, every informal understanding, every managed de-escalation that does not come with a visible demonstration of Iranian power reduces the deterrence value of everything Iran still has. The Tel Aviv attack is the answer to that internal argument. It is Iran's supreme leadership telling the IRGC factions that question the Hormuz deal that the resistance posture has not been abandoned, that the capability exists, that the will exists, and that the moment chosen for its demonstration was selected with the strategic precision that has always characterized Iranian use of military force at its most consequential. Now, here is the economic dimension of what happened last night, because this is where the story reaches beyond military strategy and into the reality that touches every person watching this video. The markets open this morning into a world that is measurably more dangerous than the world they closed in yesterday. And the price discovery that happened in the first hours of trading tells you exactly how much more dangerous the financial system believes it to be. Oil moved with the violence of a market that has had a fundamental assumption shattered. The assumption that the conflict, however serious, was operating within a set of implicit boundaries that prevented it from becoming the kind of full-scale regional war that would genuinely threaten global energy supply. That assumption is gone this morning. And when a fundamental assumption disappears from a market that prices the input that everything else depends on, the repricing is not gentle and it is not slow. The insurance market for tanker transit is the most sensitive real-time indicator of how the financial system is assessing conflict risk in the Gulf. Within hours of the Tel Aviv attack, underwriters who had cautiously returned to writing coverage for Hormuz transit after the Pakistani deal were withdrawing those offers. Not because Hormuz was physically closed again, because the attack on Tel Aviv signals an escalation trajectory that the models used to price conflict risk cannot accommodate within their existing parameters. When risk models fail, underwriters withdraw. When underwriters withdraw, the premium required to get coverage rises to levels that make the economics of tanker transit marginal for operators working on thin margins. When transit economics become marginal, the effective flow through Hormuz constricts even without a physical blockade. It constricts through the market mechanism of uninsurable risk. That constriction has the same downstream economic effect as a physical closure, just more slowly and with more plausible deniability. The equity markets are telling a story that is even more immediate for ordinary investors and pension holders. Defense stocks surged. Energy stocks surged with them. Everything else fell. The pattern is the financial system's shorthand for a world in which conflict is expanding rather than contracting, and in which the assets that benefit from conflict are the only safe harbor in an environment where normal growth assumptions cannot hold. If you have a retirement account, a pension, a portfolio of any kind, you felt the Tel Aviv attack in your financial statements this morning, even if you live 10,000 miles from Israel. That is how interconnected the global financial system is. And that interconnection is why the strategic decisions being made in Tehran and Jerusalem and Washington in the next 72 hours will have consequences that extend far beyond the Middle East into every economy that participates in the global system. Let us talk about Israel now, because the Israeli response to last night's attack is the variable that determines everything that comes next. And the pressures shaping that response are more complex and more constrained than the outside world typically recognizes when it looks at Israeli military capability and concludes that overwhelming retaliation is the obvious and inevitable answer. Israel has the military capability to deliver a response of enormous destructive power that is not in question. What is in question is what a response achieves strategically at this particular moment under these particular conditions with these particular variables in play. And the answers to that question inside the Israeli government are not as unified as the public posture of Israeli officials suggests. The Israeli military and intelligence establishment has been conducting the most intensive campaign against Iranian military infrastructure in the history of the conflict. 92% of Iran's largest naval vessels. Senior IRGC commanders eliminated. Energy infrastructure damaged in ways that are compounding the economic pressure of sanctions. Those achievements are real. They represent a degradation of Iranian conventional capability that changes the long-term strategic balance in ways that will matter for years. But last night demonstrated something that no amount of degradation of Iranian conventional capability addresses. Iran's ballistic missile arsenal and its cluster munitions capability survived the preceding campaign with enough operational capacity to conduct a barrage of unprecedented scale against Israeli population centers. And the existence of that surviving capability demonstrated last night in the most visible possible way is now the central problem of Israeli security in a way it was not 24 hours ago. The argument for maximum immediate retaliation is straightforward, and it has powerful advocates inside the Israeli system. Deterrence requires demonstrated willingness to impose costs that exceed whatever benefit the adversary calculated from the original action. If Iran calculated that the cluster munitions attack on Tel Aviv was worth the cost of Israeli retaliation, then Israeli retaliation must demonstrate that the calculation was wrong, that the cost is higher than estimated, that the next attack, if there is a next attack, will not be worth any benefit Iran could hope to achieve. The advocates of maximum retaliation will argue that anything short of that demonstration is an invitation for the next barrage and the next one and the one after that. As Iran's domestic political dynamics continue to empower the factions that see escalation as the only language that preserves Iranian deterrence credibility, the argument against maximum immediate retaliation is less instinctively satisfying but strategically more complex. Maximum retaliation against Iranian territory risks triggering the exact escalation that the Pakistani back channel was designed to prevent. It risks pulling American forces back into a direct conflict posture at a moment when American fiscal and political capacity for sustained Middle East military engagement is at its most constrained. It risks fracturing the international coalition that has provided Israel with diplomatic cover for its campaign against Iranian military infrastructure, because the optics of a devastating Israeli response to a missile attack in a world where images and narratives travel faster than any diplomatic explanation are not something that coalition can absorb without political cost in every member country. And it risks triggering Iranian responses against Gulf state infrastructure and against the remaining American military positions in the region in ways that expand the conflict to dimensions that nobody currently has the capacity to manage. This is the trap that last night's attack was designed to create. And it was designed by people who have studied Israeli decision-making for decades and who understand that the most damaging thing they can do to Israeli strategic options is not to cause destruction, but to force a choice between options that all carry serious costs. Maximum retaliation risks uncontrolled escalation. Restrained response risks deterrence collapse. No response is politically and militarily impossible. Every option Iran left Israel with is expensive. That is not an accident. That is the architecture of the attack. And recognizing it as architecture as deliberate strategic design rather than aggression for its own sake is the only way to understand what a rational Israeli response actually looks like. Here is where the American position becomes the most important variable in the next 72 hours. Because what America does and what America says it will and will not support is the single biggest constraint on Israeli decision-making in this moment. And the American position is itself constrained by factors that make it more complicated than a simple allies in crisis calculation. The $39 trillion debt, the 13 base withdrawal that is still in process, the Pakistani deal that created the Hormuz opening, and that an Israeli response massive enough to fully satisfy Israeli domestic political demand could collapse within hours. The American midterm political environment in which energy prices and economic stability are the issues that determine electoral outcomes. The carrier strike group positioning that gives America the capability to support an Israeli escalation, but that the current administration has every political incentive to avoid committing to an open-ended conflict posture. All of these factors are pressing on American decision-makers simultaneously. And the message that Washington sends to Jerusalem in the next 12 hours, the real message that goes through the direct military and intelligence channels rather than the diplomatic press statements, will be the most consequential communication in international relations since the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is that message likely to contain based on the signals that have been visible in American positioning over the preceding weeks? Based on the logic of the Pakistani deal that the current administration has invested significant political capital in protecting, and based on the fundamental constraint that $39 trillion of debt places on American willingness to write a blank check for a regional escalation with no defined endpoint. The message is likely to include both genuine support and genuine limits. America will affirm the right of self-defense. It will affirm the depth of the American commitment to Israeli security. It will provide intelligence, logistical support, and air defense supplementation. These are real and they matter. But it will also communicate through channels that preserve Israeli dignity while making the constraint undeniable that certain categories of response will not have American backing. Strikes that risk direct Iranian retaliation against American positions. Strikes that close Hormuz again before the economic situation can stabilize. Strikes that eliminate any realistic possibility of a negotiated framework emerging from what remains of the Pakistani-backed channel. These are the categories where American support will be conditional and Israeli decision-makers understand conditionality in ways that Israeli public statements almost never acknowledge. Now, let us talk about what the rest of the world is doing with the information that last night's attack delivered. Because the geopolitical consequences of a cluster munitions barrage on Tel Aviv extend far beyond the immediate military exchange and into the realignment of interests and calculations that is already happening in capitals around the world. In Moscow, the attack is being analyzed as evidence that the escalation trajectory in the Middle East is absorbing global attention and resources in ways that reduce Western capacity to focus on Ukraine. Russia has a direct interest in conflict that keeps American attention, American military resources, and American political bandwidth focused anywhere other than Eastern Europe. A Middle East crisis that escalates further serves that interest regardless of any other consideration. In Beijing, the attack is being analyzed through the lens of the Taiwan calculation. Every degree of American entanglement in the Middle East, every carrier strike group in the Arabian Sea that is not in the Western Pacific, every dollar of American defense spending committed to Israel and the Gulf that is not being invested in the Pacific deterrence architecture changes the cost-benefit calculation around Taiwan in ways that Chinese military planners are updating in real time. In Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Doha, the attack is being processed with a mixture of strategic concern and something that in private looks uncomfortably like calculation. The Gulf states have been America's most important regional partners for decades. They have hosted American forces, coordinated on intelligence, aligned their oil production with American economic preferences, and maintained the security architecture that American strategic planners have depended on since the first Gulf War. But they have been watching the erosion of that architecture for years. They watched the 13-base withdrawal. They watched the Hormuz pressure campaign produce a deal that required a Pakistani intermediary. And they are watching now as Israel absorbs the largest missile and cluster munitions attack in its history and waits for an American response that will tell them definitively how much the American security commitment is actually worth in a moment of maximum pressure. The decision they make about how much to invest in that commitment going forward will be shaped significantly by what they observe in the next 72 hours. In Ankara, the situation is being watched with the particular attention of a NATO member that has never been fully aligned with Western positions on Iran, and that has maintained its own channels to throne that give it visibility into Iranian decision-making that other NATO members do not have. Turkey's position in this conflict is one of the most underappreciated variables in the entire strategic picture. Ankara has interests that cut across every alliance line. It has NATO obligations. It has economic relationships with Iran. It has political calculations around domestic Muslim public opinion that push it toward rhetorical solidarity with Palestinian and broadly anti-Israeli positions. And it has a geographic and military significance within NATO. That means its alignment on any issue cannot be taken for granted without cost. What Turkey does with its unique position in the aftermath of the Tel Aviv attack will tell you a great deal about whether the broader international architecture for managing this crisis holds together or begins to fragment under the pressure of divergent national interests. Here is the scenario that every serious analyst of this conflict is gaming out right now and that most of the public coverage is not capturing. The scenario is not the one where the conflict escalates cleanly to a defined endpoint. It is not the scenario where diplomacy produces a framework that both sides can accept and the violence stops. The scenario that keeps serious analysts awake is the one where neither of those things happens. Where Iran absorbs that response and its internal dynamics produce a decision to respond again. Where the economic consequences of sustained conflict at that level begin to compound in ways that stress the global financial system beyond its capacity to absorb the shock. Where the $39 trillion American debt load meets rising interest rates meets oil above $130, meets a global economy that was already running on fumes from 3 years of post-pandemic inflation. Clears throat That is the scenario that the next Israeli decision, the one being made right now in the rooms that the public cannot see, either moves toward or away from. And the decision criterion that matters most is not capability. Knowing what outcome you are working toward and what actions move you toward it versus what actions feel satisfying in the short term but move you toward the deterioration scenario in the medium and long term. Not a settlement that satisfies the full demands of any party, but a settlement that is durable enough to hold, that creates enough of a framework to prevent the worst scenarios, that creates enough space for the underlying competition between American and Iranian visions of regional order to continue through means other than missiles and cluster munitions and proxy attacks and the accumulation of a national debt that is already at $39 trillion and climbing. The answer is yes. There is such a version. It does not look like a victory for anyone. It looks like an acknowledgement, formal or informal, that the current path leads somewhere that nobody currently has the capacity to manage. That Iran's strategic goals, regional influence, sanctions relief, energy stability, alliance credibility, fiscal sustainability can be served by a regional order that is less American-dominated than the one that existed before 2003, but more stable than the one that the current trajectory is producing. That framework is harder to build after last night than it was before. It is not impossible, but the window in which it can be built is narrower this morning than it was at 2:46, 1 minute before the siren started.